So, introducing Andrew Field, our speaker tonight, a very successful career in the military and equally successful career as a historian and author. And I tried to count up tonight whether I had more of his books or more of Gareth Glover's books, but I couldn't find them all scattered around the house, so I couldn't come to any conclusion on that. Andrew is a great supporter of the Waterloo Association, a very, very accomplished and professional speaker, and a great person to work with as well. Makes life very, very easy. And tonight he's going to be talking about the 3rd Division at Waterloo. So I'll hand straight over to Andrew. Do you want to share? There we go. Yep.
We're good?
Yep, we're fine. We can hear you okay. And that's it.
Okay.
Yep.
Right, good evening, everybody. I think we've got the temperatures here. I'm down in Wiltshire. We've probably got Hawaiian temperatures or Australian temperatures at the moment. Now, I know this is a pretty bland title, which I gave really before I was absolutely clear on what the focus of my talk was going to be. So actually, this is probably a better summary of what I'm going to talk about. I hope you can see all see that. Okay. So about half of it is going to be the first half of that, and then I'm going to look in detail at the second half, General Kielmansegge's arrest, because actually what happened early in the battle leads us neatly and sets a context for that second half. Some of you might know the background to Kielmansegge's arrest. For some of you, it might be completely new, and so I hope that whatever knowledge you have of that there'll be some new stuff that I'll be able to share with you tonight that will enhance your knowledge of it. So let's start first of all with having a look at the composition of the 3rd British Division. And as you can probably see there, 3 brigades, and only 1 brigade of that were made up of British troops or British regiments. And as you can see, in fact, there were 2/3 of the division were Hanoverians, rather than British, although of course the King's German Legion, although Hanoverians, was an integral part of the British Army. You can see the 5th British Brigade had 4 battalions, the 2nd King's German Legion Brigade had 4 battalions, but the 1st Hanoverian Brigade had 5 battalions and also 2 companies of field Jaeger attached to them. 2 batteries of artillery attached to the division as well, and one of these was a KGL battery. Okay, well, this was the commander of the division, as many of you might already know. Van Alten was a senior Hanoverian officer at Waterloo. He had left Hanover when the French annexed it in 1803, moved to Britain and joined the King's German Legion. He campaigned with them in Denmark, in Sweden, in the Walcheren expedition, and finally in the Peninsula. He commanded a brigade at Albuera, and also he commanded the Light Division, the famous Light Division, from 1812 to 1814. So he was actually a very experienced commander. Interesting. Of course, as you probably know, the 3rd Division was famously commanded by General Picton throughout the Peninsular War. And General Picton wrote to Wellington just before the campaign opened, lobbying hard to have the divisions renumbered so he could have his old 3rd Division once more. But Von Alten, like a number of other divisional commanders, weren't having any of that. As a campaign opened, Picton remained with the 5th Division and Von Alten with the 3rd. Now, let's just have a quick look at those 3 brigades. First of all, we've got the 5th British Brigade, commanded by Major General Sir Colin Halkett. Of course, his brother also commanded a brigade, 3rd Hanoverian Brigade at Waterloo, so the two of them shouldn't be mixed up. Interestingly, he's British, but he was born in Holland. His father was commanding a brigade in Dutch service, and when he was old enough to serve, he actually joined the Dutch army and served with them for 3 years before transferring to the British Army. He served in a number of British units before he joined the King's German Legion and commanded the 2nd Light Battalion, which of course was later to fight in the same division at Waterloo. He fought under Moore and Wellington in the Peninsula and in northern Germany, Copenhagen and the Walcheren expedition. So he commanded a brigade sort of throughout, really, most of his service in the Peninsula. So again, very experienced chap. Just to remind you, the 4 battalions that made up his brigade, actually, they were pretty inexperienced. Only the 2nd 30th, the Cambridgeshires, had any peninsular experience. They fought in the Peninsula, slowly suffering from attrition until eventually they were sent back to UK to recruit. And so out of the battalion, out of the 10 companies in the battalion, 4 of them had fought in the Peninsula. The other 6 companies were made up of recruits. So under 50% had any Peninsula experience. But the other 3 battalions, none of them had fought in the Peninsula. 33rd, the later to be the Duke of Wellington's regiment, had spent a lot of time in India and the last couple of years in the UK, although it did fight or really get involved in a number of skirmishes during 1814 as the British had a small force in the Netherlands. The 2nd 69th, again, very little experience, had fought in the Netherlands in 1814 and took part in the attempted storming of Bergen-op-Zoom, where they suffered 100 casualties and lost one of their colours. Something, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, that's going to be repeated at Quatre Bras. And then finally, the 2nd 73rd used to be a Highland regiment, and people still refer to them as Highland Regiment Waterloo. In fact, because of recruiting problems, they lost the Highland name. And at Waterloo, the only man that wore Highland dress was the Pipe Major. Everybody else fought in the British uniform that you can see in the bottom right of the screen there. The brigade did fight at Quatre Bras, and they had a pretty traumatic time there, in fact. Just look at this map. I've ringed the 4 units of the brigade there in red. And as you can see at the end, with the charge of the French cuirassiers at the end, towards the end of the battle, the 69th, having changed between line and square and then were changing back into line, were ridden down and lost a colour and suffered quite heavy casualties. The 30th, perhaps unsurprisingly, as the more experienced of the battalions, held firm in square and repulsed the charge that was made against them. And the 33rd and 73rd, seeing the cuirassiers bearing down on them rather than forming square, the battalions actually broke and ran for the security of the wood. Some of them were ridden down, but the majority of them were able to escape into wood and then reformed further to the north. So all in all, a pretty traumatic time at Quatre Bras. Okay, the 2nd KGL Brigade, King's German Legion Brigade, commanded by this chap, Colonel Charles von Ontida. Again, he was a very experienced KGL officer. He'd started his service in the Hanoverian army and had got to the rank of major before the French annexation. And then he transferred into the King's German Legion in 1803, served in Hanover and in the Mediterranean before he moved to the Peninsula. So from 1812, he served in Spain and carried on to the end of the campaign into the south of France. So again, another very experienced chap. His 4 battalions, the 1st Light and the 2nd Light battalions, were familiar to him. He'd commanded them in the Peninsula, but the establishment of the KGL battalions had been reduced at the end of the war in 1814, and the battalions were waiting to be disbanded in the Netherlands when Napoleon returned. So a lot of the foreign soldiers had been sent away, and therefore the battalions could only muster 6 companies, and the extra officers that they had were sent to the Hanoverian Landwehr battalions. So all the battalions were quite under strength, although all very experienced. The The light battalions were dressed like this, very much like the rifles, and the line battalions, unsurprisingly, dressed like the British foot battalions. They did not fight at Quatre Bras, but very experienced battalions. Then the 1st Hanoverian Brigade. I'm not a very good picture, I'm afraid, but the only one I could find of General von Kielmansegge. He commanded the 1st Hanoverian Brigade. Now, compared to the other 2 brigade commanders, he was very inexperienced, really. He'd served a little bit on and off in the Hanoverian army, sort of in the 1790s. But when the French annexed Hanover in 1803, he refused to serve and retired, and he didn't serve again until 1813. So he had a 10-year break in his military career. And as you can imagine, in those 10 years, warfare really did move on, tactics moved on. So when he volunteered to serve again in 1813, when Hanover was re-established, he was clearly a little bit behind the times. He raised a battalion of volunteer riflemen that became known as the Kilmansegge Jägers, and he led them through 1813 and 1814, and then obviously commanded the 1st Hanoverian Brigade at Waterloo. Now, this brigade consisted of regular troops. These were the battalions that had been raised after the French had been expelled from Hanover, and therefore they had at least been in existence for a couple of years, had fought through Holland, the Netherlands and Belgium in 1813 and 1814. So these guys had actually been in uniform for some time, whereas the other 3 brigades of Hanoverians at Waterloo were all Landwehr brigades with conscripts, and therefore this was seen as the sort of the stronger of the Hanoverian brigades. And as I said before, they had 5 battalions. The Lüneburg Field Battalion and the Grubenhagen Battalion were both considered as light troops, quite as light battalions, although it wasn't in their title, and they were dressed like the other rifle troops that we've already seen, like this chap here. Now, this brigade did arrive at Quatre Bras in time to take part in the fighting, but they did actually take a relatively minor role towards the end of the battle, and therefore they didn't suffer too much there, and therefore it's quite a nice introduction to battle for them before Waterloo. So those are the 3 brigades that made up the division. So 2 very experienced, well, an experienced divisional commander, 2 very experienced brigade commanders, and a relatively inexperienced brigade commander commanding the 1st Hanoverian Brigade. Now, before we move on, I just should introduce you to this chap. Captain James Shaw. He was the Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General of the 3rd Division, and as he's going to take an integral central part in our talk tonight, I thought I should introduce him. As you can see, he was later Lieutenant General Sir James Shaw Kennedy. That's probably what he was better known for, and of course was the author of this book, which many of you may well have read, and actually is a very good critique of Waterloo. So, like I say, he's quite a central figure in the story that we'll pursue later on. Okay, so let's first of all have a look at the initial deployment of the division. And in fact, this diagram that I've put there is based on the diagram that Captain Shaw includes in his history in the book that he wrote of Waterloo. So it's based exactly on that. As you can see, the 4 battalions of the 5th British Brigade are on the left there. I hope you can quickly orientate yourself with the Brussels Road on the left, Haye Sainte sort of in the top left, and the road marking the sort of the top of the ridge running from left to right, just in front of the brigade. You can see that the battalions were formed in 2 pairs. The theory was, or some histories will tell you, that the reason for that was because of the casualties that they suffered at Quatre Bras. It was felt that they were only sufficient if they formed pairs to provide a single square. So they were positioned so that the battalions could form a square, each of 2 battalions. And as you can see from the position in the diagram there, when they formed square, the faces were not opposite each other, so all faces could fire without interfering with the other square of the brigade. The 2nd King's German Legion Brigade, you probably know, the 2nd Light Battalion provided the garrison of La Haye Sainte forward of the main position, leaving 3 battalions on the ridge. The 1st Light Battalion, which you can see there on the left, the 5th Line Battalion in the front with the 1st Light Battalion, and then the 8th Line Battalion in reserve. And you can see that they were deployed individually, and therefore they provided individual squares for each battalion. And although it's not really marked on that diagram, they found themselves sheltered by the Hollow Way, the small road leading from the Brussels Road. Was quite deeply set at that stage and formed quite an obstacle for the French if they were to attack. So they were quite protected from that. And indeed, as the battle went on, the 1st Light Battalion actually deployed into the Hollow Road in order to give themselves some shelter from the artillery fire. Okay, so those are the 4 battalions of the 2nd King's German Legion. And then finally, we've got the 1st Hanoverian Brigade. And again, although there were 5 battalions, 2 of those were put in pairs, so that they would form a single square or oblong, and only the Lüneburg Battalion, one of the light battalions, formed up in column on its own. And again, you can see that all the battalions are separated by sufficient room for the columns to form into line, and if they're in pairs, the right-hand battalion formed to the right, the left-hand battalion formed to the left, and that was carefully designed by Captain Shaw. And finally, I just want to point out the 1st Nassau Regiment. Obviously, they weren't part of the 3rd Division, but as you can see, they were deployed very close to them. They were commanded by this chap, General von Cruz. The 1st Regiment, the 1st Nassau Regiment, were all new recruits. Some of them had only a few weeks in uniform. They didn't belong to the 3rd Division. They were part of Wellington's Reserve Corps. But as you can see, they were deployed fairly forward, and they are referred to often by the accounts of the 3rd Division troops. So we'll see later on again how they get involved in some of the actions that we'll hear about later. Okay, so there we've got the initial deployment. What I want to talk about now is that period of time from when the battle opened until about 6:30. Now, I'm sure many of you will know that La Haye Sainte finally fell sometime around 6 o'clock. Everyone's timings are a little bit different. So really, I'm going to look at what they got up to the time just after La Haye Sainte fell, because that is really setting the scene about what I want to talk about later. So let's start with the 5th Brigade, and this is how they spent most of their battle. Obviously, they were not involved in Durland's attack, which was to the east of the main road, and so the first action they really saw were the great cavalry charges in the second half of the afternoon of the 18th. They formed 2 oblongs, as I've already described, and they were, again, depending on which account you read, they faced somewhere between 5 and 12 charges during the afternoon. Generally speaking, the squares held well, but it was only when the French cavalry charges finished and La Haye Sainte fell, the French started pushing forwards quite big clouds of skirmishers and also a couple of artillery guns, and they came under fire from these 2 guns and these sort of crowds of skirmishers. And in fact, all the brigades of the division talk about not only the numbers of skirmishers that advanced against them, but also these 2 guns. And in fact, the Nassauers talk about these 2 guns as well. And one of their battalions attempted to charge the guns and take them, but were beaten back and then dispersed by cavalry. So by the time about 6:30, the 5th Brigade were really beginning to suffer heavy casualties, not so much from the cavalry charges, but from this infantry and from these 2 guns that were firing canister, case shot, grape shot, however you want to describe it, at relatively close range. So they had a so first half of the afternoon, reasonably solid, pretty happy. Second half of the afternoon, they really started to suffer heavy casualties. Now, the 1st Hanoverian Brigade, a number of different things I want to talk about here. Now, you have to excuse my PowerPoint skills, which aren't particularly great, as you can probably see there. But essentially what I'm trying to show is the Haye Sainte more or less in the center of the picture, with this the 2nd Light Battalion of the KGL garrisoning that. They were attacked by 2 regiments of French infantry, each of 2 battalions, so 4 battalions launched an attack against the Haye Sainte. And as they were under pressure, it was decided that the Lüneburg battalion, the light battalion, which you can see at the bottom in the center of your screen, should advance to support the 2nd Light Battalion of the King's German Legion in La Haye Sainte. So they were ordered forward to, to forward into square, and they advanced down the slope and started pushing back the French skirmishers and the French troops that were attacking La Haye Sainte. But as you can see, lurking up at the top there was a force of cuirassiers, and as the Lüneburg battalion got mixed up with the 2nd Light Battalion of the King's German Legion, the cuirassiers charged the battalion, rode them down before they could form square, and basically the battalion broke up. Some ran into the garden and into the buildings of the Haye Sainte and became part of the garrison, but most of them ran back up the slope to try and get to what they perceived as the safety of the ridge, but many of them were cut down. When they mustered back on the ridge, the captain that was left in charge, Captain Jacobi, could muster only 50 men of the 400 and so that had started off down the slope. And he reported to General Kielmansegge, the brigade commander, and said, "What should I do? We're down to 50 men." And General Kielmansegge said, "Right, collect your men up. I want you to march back down the Brussels road towards Brussels and go to Brussels. And along the way, I want you to gather up all the stragglers from your regiment," which, taking even a body of 50 men, is quite an unusual thing to do, to take them out of the line. And actually, Captain Jacobi says in his account of the battle that perhaps a general with more experience would not have given such an order. And perhaps this was a little warning about what was to come. So the Lüneburg battalion was out of the line and out of the battle. As for the other 4 battalions of the brigade, you can see on this old Hanoverian map that, as I said, they formed 2 squares with the Osnabrück and Grubenhagen on the left and the Verden and Bremen field battalions on the right, and they went through the charges of the French cavalry, and the two squares held well and repulsed all the charges against them. So they again had not suffered too much, but again, once La Haye Sainte fell, that cloud of skirmishers and these 2 guns that came up onto the high ground really started hammering them. They suffered heavy casualties. They acknowledged that it would be pointless to try and assault these 2 guns as the Nassauers had attempted. So they stood there in the square, and under the weight of fire, several times the square was beaten back from its position shown here, and they were probably only stopped from going further, withdrawing further, by the British cavalry that was formed up behind them. And they stopped against this wall of horses, and the cavalry officers and their own officers were able to reform them, rally them, reform them in square, and then move them back into position in the line. But they, like the 5th British Brigade, had really suffered from the French attacks that came after the cavalry attacks. Okay, so what about the 2nd King's German Legion Brigade? And their battle revolved around this place. Of course, La Haye Sainte, very famous picture showing the 2nd Light Battalion as the garrison there, with George Baring on horseback in the middle. You can see that there are red uniforms there because during the afternoon, the Light Battalion from the 5th King's German Legion Line Battalion was sent as reinforcements. And on the right, in the strange shakos, you can see some Nassauers, light companies of Nassauers, were also sent down to form the garrison. but the problem was a lack of ammunition. As the day wore on and they used up their ammunition, no more was forthcoming and no more was sent down from the line, and therefore the defence became increasingly desperate. So that was the 2nd KGL and their battle based around La Haye Sainte. Now, for the 2 line battalions in that brigade, the 5th and the 8th line battalions, they say about 2 o'clock in their accounts. Well, the Lüneburg battalion say 2 o'clock was when they launched their first counterattack down towards La Haye Sainte. So I presume that these 2 battalions were ordered forward a little time later than that. You can see there the French had now invested La Haye Sainte, were desperately trying to break in. And so the 5th and 8th battalions of the King's German Legion were ordered to move down the slope to throw back the French battalions that were attacking La Haye Sainte. As they moved down, they saw the French cuirassiers moving towards them and desperately tried to form square. The 8th battalion hadn't quite formed square when the cuirassiers struck them, and their square was broken up. The 5th line battalion, though, because of the time that the 8th battalion bought for them, were able to form square and didn't suffer anywhere nearly as badly as the 8th battalion. Indeed, the 8th battalion pretty much admit that their whole battalion would probably have been destroyed if it hadn't have been for the charge of the Household Brigade that attacked the cuirassiers and threw them back down into the bottom of the valley and back towards their own lines. The 8th line battalion was therefore able to rally back on the ridge line, but by their own accounts, their casualties have been such that they were only able to form a small square. The 5th battalion, as I say, was largely untouched. So just quickly going back then to the 2nd Light Battalion, La Haye Sainte, as I say, as they ran out of ammunition, so the French started pressuring them more until they couldn't hold on any longer. They'd emptied all the ammunition pouches of the casualties, and therefore had pretty much the defence was over, and Bering ordered them to withdraw back up onto the ridge. When he got back up onto the ridge, he was only able to muster 40 men of the 400 that had been a part of the garrison. And throughout his accounts of the battle, he speaks of how loyal his men were, how ready they were to continue fighting, and that as long as he was there, then they were prepared to fight. What's interesting is when they got back up onto the ridge line, in a later letter, he complains that all those 40 men that he was able to rally slowly drifted away until he found himself without any men remaining of his battalion at all. So again, by the time, or not long after the building, the farm had fallen, the 2nd Light Battalion had pretty much ceased to exist. So as far as a brigade is concerned, the only battalion, well, there are 2 battalions left. The 1st Light Battalion, as I say, which I've now shown in the hollow road there, but the 5th Line Battalion. So the French had taken over La Haye Sainte, as you see, as I've tried to represent there, and an ADC, an aide-de-camp from General Owen, came to the commanding officer of the 5th Line Battalion and ordered it to try to launch an attack and recapture La Haye Sainte. The brigadier, General von Ontida, said, no, that's a suicide mission. We know that there are French cuirassiers in the bottom of the valley. There's a brigade of infantry in front of me. This is madness. And so the ADC rode off, and Van Alten and the Prince of Orange turned up and ordered him to launch the attack. Now, Ontida was actually the colonel of the 5th Line Battalion, although he hadn't commanded them as lieutenant colonel. And as he thought this was a suicide mission, his sense of honor demanded that he should lead the attack. And so he ordered the 5th Line Battalion to form into line and to advance with him in the lead down the slope towards La Haye Sainte. And just as the Lüneburg Battalion had been wiped out pretty much, just as the 8th Line Battalion had been cut up and dispersed, so the same thing happened to the 5th Line Battalion. And it's rather hard to believe that 3 battalions had been pretty much annihilated in the same way each time. And yet that is what happened. And therefore, 2 of the battalions from the King's German Legion Brigade had been wiped out by that same force of cuirassiers. What I'm just needed a quick look at my thing. The battalion lost its colour, and only 19 fit men, that was a figure I was looking for, only 19 fit men were mustered by the battalion back on the ridge after this abortive attack. So let's sum up the situation then at this point. We've heard about the 5th Brigade, the 1st Hanoverian Brigade, and now the 2nd King's German Legion Brigade. And so, as a summary, this is where we are. So Halkett's brigade had pretty much repulsed all the French cavalry attacks, and although they had suffered heavy casualties from the French skirmishers and from these 2 French guns, they were still generally battle-worthy. However, in his book, Captain Shaw wrote that little quote at the bottom, which I'll let you read. So effectively, what he was saying is those 2 brigades no longer held their position, and that perhaps we could infer from that they'd retired or moved at least back from the ridgeline into the dead ground behind. And so that's where the 3rd Division stood at about 6:30 after the loss of Haye Sainte. And this is where we come to what I found is a really interesting event. I discovered this story as I was conducting my research for the last talk I gave, in fact, this time about last year, on Wellington's allies, when I was looking into the Hanoverian troops and their performance during the battle. And I picked up in some of the accounts something that made me take a bit of closer interest. And as I researched this, the story came out then that after the battle, the general had been arrested. And as I dug a bit more, I came up with my sort of interpretation of why he had been arrested. And it was only at the end of that research that I learnt about this. Now, this is taken from the Waterloo Association journal. It was, I think, written back in 2005 by Gareth Glover, well-known author, and he wrote an article covering the arrest of Kielmansegge. And what I found when I read through it is that, if you like, his conclusions and his interpretation were quite different to mine. And so what I'm going to do now is quickly go through, summarize, if you like, Gareth's interpretation, and then I'm going to bring out the evidence that suggests perhaps everything isn't quite what it seemed. Now, 2 days after the battle, so on the 20th of June, Wellington, having returned to Brussels, written his reports and recovered from the battle, then rode forward to join his army. He overtook the 3rd Division as it crossed into France. Now, at that time, the division was commanded by General Kielmansegge, because von Alten had been wounded at Waterloo. He'd handed over command briefly to General Halkett, who had then very soon afterwards had been wounded, and therefore command of the division had passed to General Kielmansegge. And as Wellington passed the division, he ordered that Kilmansegge should be placed under arrest. Now, needless to say, this caused quite an uproar, people wondering why this should be. Well, the reason was the report that had been written by General von Alten on his sickbed in Brussels the day after the battle, when he had written the report on the events surrounding the 3rd Division. And this is what he said in that report. So obviously the key things I've highlighted in red there. So if you like, the charge, if that's the right way to put it, against Kielmansegge, that he had withdrawn the division from the line of battle without orders and without informing anybody, and withdrew them into the rear of the village of Mont Saint-Jean. And I'm sure those of you that know the battlefield will realise that that is quite a distance back. There's an old map showing, I put on the front line, you can see the village is about 1 kilometre behind the front line. And actually that report says it was behind the village. So you could argue that it was beyond where my blue line finishes. So it was more than 1 kilometre behind the front line. Now, that, of course, understandably incensed Wellington that he hadn't been informed that the division had withdrawn. And that is from that report. So you need to bear in mind, of course, that Van Alten had been wounded before this event. And as you saw in his report, it was actually, he's saying that it was Kielmansegge that oversaw the withdrawal of the division. But he obviously wasn't a witness to that because he had been wounded and evacuated from the battle. And therefore, he must have based that part of the account on having spoken to officers, possibly in the divisional headquarters, or other officers that were wounded and back in Brussels. And therefore, he was not a witness to that actually happening. Now, let's see what Captain Shaw had to say about this. So he goes on to write this, which is perhaps most pertinent. So here we've got the Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General speaking with Wellington and telling him that it was an unintentionally false report, and then goes on to say that it was totally erroneous. Okay. But he doesn't actually say why or what was in the report that was erroneous, other than you must suppose that the 3rd Division, he is saying that the 3rd Division didn't withdraw from the line of battle at all. So just after he had this conversation with Wellington, Wellington received another letter from Van Alten. And this is what he wrote. Now, I've deliberately not put it there because there's quite a lot of words here. I want you just to read the bits that I've highlighted in red, because these are the key phrases that we need to continue the story. So he's saying it was an unintentional error in his report, and that the expression withdrawn from the, which I used, was not the proper one. But he doesn't go on to clarify what that should be. He then makes an appeal on behalf of Kielmansegge, and he finishes his letter with this paragraph. He asks for an inquiry. But actually, Wellington chose not to have that inquiry, and it appears that the conversation that he'd had with Captain Shaw perhaps was sufficient to convince him that the 3rd Division did not withdraw from the line of battle back to Mont Saint-Jean. And so actually Kielmansegge was indeed reinstated to command of the 3rd Division and led it down into Paris. And then, if you like, as a sign of his favour, Wellington invited Kielmansegge to accompany him in his carriage to a reception held by Louis XVIII when he was back in Paris. So, if you like, it seemed as if that it was all a misunderstanding, and that Kielmansegge was cleared, and he was shown to be back in favour with Wellington by attending the reception with him. So let's just look at these 3 maps, all by noted historians. On the left, you can see Sir John Fortescue, top right, Siborne's map, and then in the bottom right, a sketch map really by De Baa, a very well-known Dutch historian. Now, just in case you get confused, the one on the left and Siborne's map at the top, they are both orientated looking towards the north. So south at the bottom, north is at the top. But the sketch map in the bottom right by Debat is orientated the other way round from the north, looking down to the south. And you can see these are maps from those people showing the deployment at the time of the attack of the Imperial Guard. And so what you can see here, that according to these three renowned Waterloo historians, both Kielmansegge's and Optida's brigades are still in line. And Halkett brigade is also still in line. So if you like, that is almost confirmation from some quite renowned historians that actually, by the time of the Imperial Guard, the 3rd Division was in the front line. Okay. So it just seems, therefore, the situation was resolved. The 3rd Division hadn't withdrawn. It was a misunderstanding that stemmed from von Alten's report, part of which he had written on the accounts of others. And therefore, Kielmansegge was found, if you like, not guilty of the charge and reinstated into command. So it seems the situation was resolved. Or was it? And this, of course, is where my own story starts. So remember that what we're talking about now is a situation just before the attack of the Imperial Guard. So after the French had captured Haye Sainte and had started attacking the main ridgeline with these guns that we've heard about, and with swarms of skirmishers firing at close range against the lines of British troops. So let's have a look again at what Captain Shaw had to say about the situation. Again, the most important lines I've put in red. So he is saying now that they could not hold their position on the line, and that there was a gap in the line between Halkett's left and Kempt's right. So let's have a look at that on a map using Siborne's map. So on the right of the picture as we're looking at it, but 3rd Division's left, was General Kempt. Of course, by this time Picton had been killed and Kempt had taken over command of the 5th Division. On the left of the map as we're looking is Halkett's brigade. So what Captain Shaw is saying now is that the line between Kempt's troops and Halkett's troops was unprotected, suggesting that there weren't any troops there. Now, that you can see why I was starting to get a little bit perplexed. So let's go back to Siborne's, and as you can see, actually, in this map, you can see that the gap, if you like, between Kielmansegge and Halkett has been filled by the Brunswick troops and the Nassauers. And this is where, again, what Captain Shaw had to say about it. So having identified that there was a big gap in the line, Shaw rode over to Wellington, pointed it out, and Wellington said to him, I'll get the Brunswickers there, and I want you to go back and get as many Germans as you can to help fill the gap. So now we're back to having a gap there again. Now, we all know that the Brunswickers were ordered there, and I've put them in the black ring. 5 battalions of Brunswickers were indeed ordered by Wellington to that point. And as you can see there, the Nassauers also apparently stood in that gap, and I must presume that that was Shaw's work, had rushed back, grabbed the Nassauers and helped plug the gap, if you like. Those were the Germans that he was talking about. So now we have that gap closed. Okay, so let's have a look now at the report of Kielmansegge's brigade. Now again, it might as well just have a look at the red. This is the brigade report, so we presume it was endorsed by General Kielmansegge. It first of all says that the Hanoverian battalions were forced to retire, and then the remaining battalions of the 3rd Division reassembled in close proximity to these. So they all withdrew from the front line, and then you can see at the end that it actually says that they didn't go back into line until the enemy had withdrawn. So what this is sort of telling us is that actually, yes, the 3rd Division did withdraw out of line and then only moved back into line after the French had been repulsed. Okay, so this is rather interesting. So let's now hear from the adjutant of the 1st Light Battalion. There's a chap called Ensign Boozer, and although he was quite junior in rank, he was a very experienced soldier. He'd come up through the ranks, so he had fought through the Peninsular War. And I'll leave you just to quickly read that. So he's telling us that the whole of the 3rd Division withdrew somewhat. And they remained in that position until after 7 o'clock, after the attack of the French Guards. Well, actually, that will have been a bit later than that. But he's stating categorically that it was only after the enemy had been defeated and withdrawn that they advanced again back into line. So this seems to be supporting Van Auten's original report and undermining what Captain Shaw has told Wellington. Let's hear quickly from the commanding officer of the 5th Line Battalion of the King's German Legion. He says, the quote at the bottom, and again I've highlighted in red, and you will note that he states categorically that they were ordered to take position several hundred paces to the rear and that they stayed there until the enemy began his retreat. So here is a commanding officer of one of the battalions in the division saying that they were ordered to retreat and didn't advance again until the French had been defeated. I've got just one more quote I want to read, because this comes from the Hanoverian Brigade, one of the units in the 1st Hanoverian Brigade. And he there is backing up what the other two have already said. The brigadier gave the order to assemble at the village of Mont Saint Jean. And then they were there, he says, until 9 o'clock. And then the division, now commanded by Kielmansegge, advanced once more to the battlefield. And when they arrived on the battlefield, they only saw the French in the distance, the fleeing enemy. So he too is saying that the 3rd Division were not in line at the time of the attack of the Imperial Guard. Okay, so what about the Nassau troops? Well, again, just read the red bit. General von Cruz, who commanded them, he admits that they fell into disorder, and the remaining battalions of the 1st line soon followed. And so the plateau was only then held by small bodies of brave men. And he withdrew out of line of fire where the enemy fire could have little effect on them. So he admits that the Nassauers also withdrew from the front line. So who did fill the gap? The gap must have been filled because the French were attacking and the Imperial Guard was attacking. Well, this is interesting, because to answer this, we have to start right over on the Allied left. And the brigade of Colonel von Vincker, the 5th Hanoverian Brigade, as you can see circled there, they were on the left of the line overlooking the village of Papelotte. And von Vincker states that once the d'Erlon's attack had been repulsed, he was ordered to take a second position behind the 5th Division, so Picton's original division, now Kemp's division, to serve as a reserve for that division, because that, of course, is where d'Erlon's main attack landed. So he moved from the extreme left into the centre, and then he was moved again from there to here. Now, again, we've reversed the orientation, I'm afraid, but I just think this shows very clearly where those battalions, his 4 battalions, formed up, either side of the Brussels road, in depth to the main position. And as you can see, Kielmansegge's and Antieda's brigades, the Nassauers and the Brunswickers are all shown in the front line. With the up in the north, you can see the Moyen Guard, the Middle Guard, the French Guard launching their attack with the 3rd Division in position, and these 2 this brigade in depth. Now, what happened next? Well, let's hear from the commanding officer of the Hanoverian battalion, and he describes what happened next there. So after 5:30, or about that time, he was ordered to the other side of the main road. And on the right of the battalions stood the Nassauers, and on the left were the English regiments of the 5th Division. So he doesn't mention the 3rd Division at all. He's saying the Nassauers were on his right. Well, actually, he's got them mistaken for the Brunswickers, because we know that the Brunswickers were now filling the gap to the right of where they moved. So he is saying that his battalion moved into the front line on the right-hand side, or the western side of the main Brussels road. And that is supported by von Vincke himself, who reports that he was sent with the other battalion, the Gifhorn battalion, across the high road, where he was to take place in front of the 1st Saar Regiment of the King's German Legion, next to the Brunswick infantry. Well, he gets the infantry right. The Nassauers wore a very dark green uniform, so it would be quite easy in the height of battle to get them mixed up with the black of the Brunswickers. But von Vincke obviously got that right. So actually, what we've got now, neither of them talking at all about units of the 3rd Division, except if you see in the last line, von Vincke says they were more or less where the Grubenhagen battalion had been previously, but they weren't there anymore. Why not? Well, because I think we're seeing now that they had withdrawn from the line of battle. And so this is actually what those maps should show, or this is my interpretation of it, when the attack of the Imperial Guard. So Halkett is still in position. Next to them is the 5 battalions of the Brunswickers. And then in the middle there, we have the Hameln battalion and the Gifhorn battalion, both Landwehr battalions of the 5th Hanoverian brigade. And as you can see, Vivian's brigade behind, including the 1st King's German Legion Hussars that were mentioned by von Vincke. So this is actually what we should show. Now, maybe the Nassauers, if you remember, von Creuse said that they had withdrawn from the height into the dead ground. So it might be that the Nassauers were in that position that I put them there, rather than having withdrawn behind the cavalry, because actually Vivian's own accounts talk about the Nassauers moving back as far as his cavalry, and his cavalry forming a wall that wouldn't let them go any further. And so if we can now compare on the left sideborns, which show the 3 brigades of the 3rd Division in line at the attack of the Old Guard, and on the right, what I believe the first-hand accounts of both the King's German Legion Brigade, the 1st Hanoverian Brigade, and the 5th Hanoverian Brigade all tell us that was the way that the troops were lined up at the attack of the Old Guard, and that the 3rd Division were clearly out of the battle. Now, if that's true, how come Kielmansegge got away with it? Was there a cover-up? Because I think we've seen sufficient evidence now to convince us that the 3rd Division were not in line with attack the Old Guard, despite most histories having them there, and as I've shown you, most maps having them there too. Well, let's just quickly go back to Van Auten's letter. I've highlighted something different here. There in his report later, so when he was sort of trying to make up ground and say I was in the wrong, what he writes there is what we've already seen. So actually, although he was trying to protect Kielmansegge, even in his second letter, he says that the division had been collected in the rear of Mont Saint-Jean. But he was, if you like, he was saying in order to justify it, he was saying that they hadn't left their position without order and been broken and forced back by the enemy, but they had moved back under the sanction of the general officer commanding, i.e. Kielmansegge. Right? So what he's doing is protecting the reputation of his division by saying they weren't broken, they were ordered to the rear by General Kielmansegge. And so, if you like, he's backing up the interpretation that I've just given you. And you'll see there that at the end he asked for an inquiry of the commanding officers to see if he gave an account. Now, this inquiry, as I've already said, didn't take place, but remember, we've heard from the commanding officer of the 5th Line Battalion, King's German Legion Battalion, who said he was ordered to the rear. And maybe that explains why there wasn't an inquiry, because presumably a number of the other COs will have admitted that that's what happened too. So, sorry, I just a bit quick there. So, in that case, why didn't Kielmansegge get disciplined for this? Why didn't he stay under arrest? Why wasn't he taken from command by Wellington? And I think the answer lies here. And here. So I believe that Wellington decided that rather than hang up their dirty washing in public, he was going to keep it quiet, not order an inquiry, and let sleeping dogs lie. And that actually the 3rd Division did in fact leave the line of battle under orders of General Kielmansegge, but Wellington chose not to take any further action. There we go. Just on an hour.
Right, okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
That means other people can. Thank you once again for a truly brilliant talk. You could really smell the gunpowder there, as you explained it, a real detailed forensic analysis of where the division was and how it fared during the battle. And you were very modest about your skills with PowerPoint, but they're certainly much better than mine and many other speakers. So well done on that. And the resources that you brought to our attention are really outstanding. You know, the diary extracts and the map work and so on. But I really enjoyed that. Very, very gripping indeed. And as always, very eloquently presented. So we'll start to go through the questions. There's a lot of them, and we mustn't put Andrew under the cosh too much.
I'd like to say, and of course, I hope I made it clear, this is definitely my interpretation. And of course, I can't show every account that was given over this time, because there are, without doubt, quite a few that from officers within the division that don't mention this withdrawal. And so I can well see that people would and could challenge my interpretation. Like I say, it's very much my own, but I'm quite happy to defend my position.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes, I've ended your as I can do as host. I have tremendous power. I've ended your sharing of the screen. We've got lots of nice comments from Mike Robinson, break a leg, Andrew, and hello from various parts of the world and from the United States. And so we get on to various parts of the world as well as the United States. Right, on to the questions. What units made up the forward skirmishers in front of the 3rd Division? That's from Peter Cross.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, different divisions played it in slightly different ways. Normally, it was all the light companies of the line battalions would have provided a skirmish screen in the front of their own battalions. I know that some divisions formed a light battalion and put it under command of a lieutenant colonel, and the battalion was made up of the light companies of each of the battalions in the brigade or the division. So it did vary from division to division and probably from brigade to brigade. Of course, in the KGL, for example, the first light battalion was an all-light battalion, and when you read their accounts, it seems that they spent most of their time, almost the whole battalion, in skirmish order in front of the position, with just a reserve kept in the hollow way where they were protected, formed up and protected from the artillery fire. So generally speaking, the light companies of each battalion provided the skirmish screen in front of the brigade or division.
Yep. Okay, and that's certainly Mike Robinson agrees with that. He said exactly the same in his comment. He saw the question on the chat. Greg Pedlow, the transfer of von Vink from the left side to the right of Wellington's line was presumably made possible by the arrival of elements of the Prussian First Corps on Wellington's left.
Absolutely, but I think they left there about 4 o'clock, so it was probably a little bit early for the Prussians to have made much of an appearance there. I think by that time, though, Wellington had appreciated where the French efforts were coming. You probably know that the left flank, because of Papelotte, Mahane, the Frischemont hamlet and chateau, and the sunken lanes and the hedges there, made that really difficult country, and that wasn't a likely French axis of assault. And so I think Wellington was very keen to reinforce his centre as soon as he felt that he could do, and he took the 5th Hanoverian Brigade out to form a reserve to the 5th Division and didn't replace it. So actually the 4th Hanoverian Brigade, which was next door to them, just spread out further and covered the line, and they were never really threatened. So it was a sensible redeployment of troops from a quiet area to what was becoming a very threatened area.
Okay, great. Lots of very positive comments. Very interesting, Andrew. Thank you. Very interesting. From John Thornley, is it possible some more senior officer ordered Kielmansegge to withdraw?
Well, Alton certainly couldn't have done, because, i.e. the divisional commander, because he had been wounded and gone back. And of course, the commander of the Allied centre during the battle was the Prince of Orange. And his actions are quite well documented. And having insisted that the 5th KGL Line Battalion launch their counterattack against La Haye Sainte and saw them cut up by the cuirassiers, he is described rallying and leading back the units of the division back, and leading the Nassauers in their counterattack and leading them back into line. So it is possible, but no one suggests that it was him. And I think Van Outen in his said the general officer commanding. Well, of course, the correct military description of a divisional commander is the GOC, the general officer commanding. So the Prince of Orange was the corps commander, so he was senior, so theoretically he could have done, but there is no mention of that. And given that he was really closely involved in the various counterattacks and the rallying of the different units as they come under pressure, I'm not sure if it was him. There's no suggestion that I'd read that it was him. Could it have been? Yes, it could have been. But I'd have thought that Kielmansegge would have used that as some sort of defence.
Okay, from Brian Southwell, maybe Wellington should have spent more time by Picton and La Haye Sainte instead of always being around the guards looking for a fictitious French outflanking movement. That doesn't sound quite a question, but
well,
yeah,
I mean, it is interesting. Though Shaw rode across to meet Wellington over on the Allied right, and of course we know he was near the guards when the attack of the guard took place. So I think there's something to be said for that, I've got to admit. There's always a danger of being rude about guards. I don't want to do that. But I think by that time of the battle, it was clear that the French were not going to launch an outflanking attack round the Allied right. It was far too late in the day for them to attempt that.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for a very interesting talk, excellent talk, as expected. From David Tomlinson, how long do you think the hole existed for?
Yeah, that's really difficult. The main reason it's particularly difficult is that every account you read gives a different time. The Lunenburg Battalion say they launched their counterattack at La Haye Sainte at 2 p.m. The 5th Line Battalion, the KGL, said they launched their counterattack at 2 p.m. And then, as you saw in some of the extracts that I put towards the end, as to what time they withdrew from the line and what time they moved forward again, people have that any time from about 5:30, I think, up until 9 o'clock that they actually moved there. So knowledge of timings throughout the battle really are so contradictory that we can't be absolutely sure. I mean, my feeling is that when the 5th King's German Legion Battalion were annihilated in their attack, when the brigadier was killed, by that time that brigade was really down to half battalion of the 1st Battalion. Therefore, I would think it was pretty soon after 6:30, that sort of time, that they withdrew. And the Nassauers say that there were bodies of brave bodies of men still fighting there. But of course, the 5 Brunswick battalions would have taken a little bit of time to march over from the right, where they were in line above Hougoumont there. So it's an interesting question, actually. And like I say, unfortunately, not one that you can answer with any sort of authority based on the timings given by the protagonists.
Okay.
But given that the French were putting pressure on the line there, it can't have been too long.
Thank you. Okay. Greg Pedlow said, do any war diaries or staff journals of the units exist? Yeah,
absolutely. Because after my last talk on the Guard, someone raised a question about references. I have got a slide with the references, the key references I used, and in those it has got all the first-hand accounts of the King's German Legion, of the Hanoverians, of the Nassauers, and to stop having to go back there, I would recommend people look at Gareth Glover's series called the Waterloo Archives, because 3 of those I think are in mine, and they cover a lot of the correspondence, reports, and so on, of the Hanoverian battalions, and of course his British ones, the same for the 5th Brigade. So there are plenty to draw on, and that's what I've been looking at over things. So there is some really good, useful information there, but a lot of it, like all these original sources, quite contradictory.
Yeah. Okay, at the time this is from Rob, at the time the 2 German brigades of the 3rd Division withdrawn, how many men were still with the colours? How many battalions were still combat effective?
Yeah, well, if we start from the left, the 2nd King's German Legion Brigade, 2nd Light Battalion had drifted away by their commander's admission, so they no longer existed. The 5th Line Battalion was down to 19 men. That's according to the commanding officer. The 8th Battalion said they had so few men left, they could only form a small square. So they were right on the cusp, I suspect, of being combat effective. And so really only the 1st Light Battalion had not been really seriously engaged or ridden down by the cuirassiers. So there really wasn't very much left of the KGL Brigade. The Hanoverians, I think, they were probably stronger. I'd have to go back and have a look at the overall casualties for the day. But of course, many of these battalions say they were down to 19 men. And when you look at their official casualties a couple of days later, a lot of people who had drifted away or helped casualties to the rear came back. And the total out of maybe 500 men, the casualties are about 150. But it's an interesting reflection on how many men actually stayed in line and fought right to the bitter end. And the answer was really not very many.
Okay, thank you. From John Thornley, for Wellington to deliberately ignore this major weakness is understandable in view of the victory, but if he really disapproved, why take Kay with him on, try to do it from memory, Kay with him in his carriage to show his personal approval? Yeah, well, I mean, that is what happened. That's well documented. And you know, I can only suppose, as I sort of showed you those 2 quotes from Wellington at the end, that he decided that, you know, he didn't want to examine these sort of things too closely, and having arrested Kielmansegge, and then of course not sort of charged him or not court-martialed him, it was really, he really had no option but to show that it had been a mistake and that nothing had gone wrong. So I think it was really to make up for having had him arrested or ordered him to be arrested. And he felt he had no option to reinstate him and show people that actually
everything had been sorted out.
Yeah. Okay. There's a healthy debate about the artillery and the range of canister and so on, but I think the debate has answered the questions people have had. From Mike Fox, wasn't Kielmansegge wounded? If so, when?
He wasn't wounded. I believe yeah. I don't know. It's one of these I'll look it up and get back to you sort of moments. I believe he had a horse killed underneath him. I don't believe he was actually wounded. He certainly wasn't wounded so severely that he had to leave the battle. So if he might have had a scratch or a bruise, a contusion from a dead ball or something like that, but he certainly remained in command during the battle, and he was not evacuated. So if he was wounded, and I don't recall, but he may have been. So I think he was well enough to continue in command.
Yep. Okay, thank you. I'll just take a couple more questions because we've got to give Andrew time to get and sit and relax in the garden with a glass of something. So from Peter Cross, thank you, Andrew, for an excellent talk. For anyone interested, Scott Bowden's armies at Waterloo give casualties for each battalion of the 3rd Division. So that's very helpful. Thank you. The debate about the artillery has ended with a question: why was British cannon not shooting up the 2 French cannons that were causing so much damage?
Yeah, well, from what I can see, the British artillery, most of it was out of ammunition, and a lot of it had been pulled out of the line because it run out of ammunition. There is still a debate about this, and in a way, it's a shame that that Stephen's not here as the great artillery expert. But from what I've read, certainly the French Guard talk about advancing against the British line and hardly coming under an awful lot of artillery fire. But those 2 guns, they seem to have they were mentioned by all 3 brigades of the division and the Nassauers of causing heavy casualties. And then they don't get mentioned again. And you've got to think that perhaps the crews were shot down, because you certainly don't hear about them withdrawing either. And you'd think if they pushed 2 guns right up onto the ridgeline, that it would have been very difficult to get them away. And you could quite understand that the crews had been shot down. But you don't hear about French abandoned guns on the position. A fascinating question, and I don't know the answer to that. I really have tried to work out where they could have put 2 guns without being so close to the British units or the Allied units that they wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. But the accounts of their fire is that it was extremely effective. Okay.
And just Mike Fox, who asked a question about him being wounded, said that Adkin reports him as wounded. But then Robert Burnham, and that'd be the last question, because the speakers do put a huge amount of mental energy into this, particularly on Zoom. But I think the questions are coming to an end anyway. If the Germans had not been withdrawn, would there have been room to deploy the Brunswickers, the Nassauers and Vink?
That's a good question. And at one stage, I measured everything out and tried putting them in different formations. The Brunswickers their accounts say that they had only just arrived on the position, so in column, when the French Guard reached the ridgeline and pushed them back. Now, I think we generally accept that it wasn't the Guard that pushed the Brunswickers back. It was French line troops that were attacking from Haye Sainte. Again, it depends on casualties, depends on the size of the units, and I started that exercise, but it's really difficult to know how many men were left in the various battalions that would have formed up there. If they'd have been full strength, absolutely not. But of course, by that time, like I say, one of the battalions said there were only 19 men left. So I guess by that time of the battle, if the 3rd Division, even if the 3rd Division hadn't withdrawn, they were in some of the battalions were so small that they probably took up no room at all.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And just then, lots of very nice comments. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I enjoyed the exploration and assessment of the source material, as we all do. A great presentation. Need more of these exercises showing the moving parts of the battle at different phases. Yeah, that was very, very good, but you need Andrew's PowerPoint skills. John Thornley, damn close run thing sounds even more like an understatement than we thought. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. From Jerry, my piece on who were the Nassauers is in the journal members area. Very thought-provoking. Thank you, Andrew. It's amazing that so much that is new can be drawn out of this battle. And wonderful talk, a fitting end to this series. Okay, and just thank Andrew one more time. We all knew it was going to be a great talk. It was, as always, and really enjoyed it. And thank you all for attending. Oh, Gareth, Andrew, you did get over 50, which is great. I won't. It would be rather churlish to compare that with any of our other speakers, but well done. 51 in when it's brilliant weather. We haven't had lockdown has been released slightly, and people get a bit Zoom tired. 51 is great credit to your name and your reputation. So thank you, everybody. Just a final plug. Couple of things from me, rather a plug for the Waterloo Association, and see the quality of speakers that we can bring to you. If anybody here is not a member of the Waterloo Association, why not have a look on the website and join? It's a fantastic organisation. And also the Midlands event, now whether it's live, which is likely, I presume, or whether we might be able to link in some way with Zoom so that members and others living a distance away from the Midlands, we will hope to have, with Brian's organisational skills as well, another event in June of 2022, probably in Warwick. And I'll book Andrew as soon as we've finished here. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending. Let's just finish by, if you know how to give Andrew a digital clap, please do that. Or thumbs up, or even a red heart. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Brian. Okay, thank you, everybody. Really good. And I'll start, if you start ending the meeting, I'll end it formally in a moment. Okay, thank you, everybody.